In the heart of Eldridge, a small town where secrets run as deep as the roots of its old oak trees, the courtroom was both a symbol of justice and a place where the powerful and the powerless collided. For years, Judge Luther Grayson had presided over cases with an iron fist, using his position not to uphold the law, but to feed his ego and indulge his prejudice. His notorious reputation for humiliating black defendants was well known, yet nothing seemed to deter him. He had seen hundreds of cases come and go, and each time, he made sure to remind the people of Eldridge who was truly in control. Today, however, the courthouse would witness something it had never seen before, a challenge not from an outsider, but from someone who knew the law better than Grayson ever could. Amara Rivers, a top-tier lawyer with a razor-sharp mind and an unshakable sense of justice, found herself in the dock. Falsely accused of a minor traffic infraction, Amara knew it wasn't just about a parking ticket, it was about something much deeper, a system built on bias and corruption. It was a quiet Thursday morning in the city of Eldridge, a typical day in a typical courtroom. The air hummed with the soft murmur of anticipation as the cases began to stack up. But today, something felt different. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense that something was about to unfold that would shake the very foundations of this little town's justice system. The courtroom was old, its wooden panels darkened with age. The walls were lined with portraits of past judges who had ruled over the city, some with pride, others with a chilling indifference that hinted at years of controversial decisions. The high wooden bench, polished to a gleam, loomed in front of the room, flanked by heavy curtains that seemed to shut out the light, casting the room in a gloomy half-darkness. It was as though the weight of history and all the wrongs committed in this very room had soaked into the walls, leaving an invisible stain on the atmosphere. At the center of it all sat Judge Luther Grayson, a man whose reputation was as well known as it was despised. At 63, Grayson had spent nearly 35 years on the bench. His career had been marked by one controversial case after another, but it was his treatment of black defendants that had earned him a particularly sordid reputation. Tales of his racist remarks and blatant prejudice had spread far beyond Eldridge, but his ability to manipulate the law and the system kept him firmly entrenched in power. Many had tried to challenge him over the years, but none had succeeded, until today. Grayson's eyes were cold and calculating as he surveyed the room. His robes were slightly faded, as though they had been through many years of abuse, much like his approach to the law. His hair, thin and graying, was combed neatly to the side, though it did little to mask the deep lines etched into his face from years of hard, unrepentant living. His thick glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, but his vision never seemed to extend beyond the surface of people. He would often gaze down from his high seat, scrutinizing his subjects with a look of superiority that made those who appeared before him shrink with discomfort. Today, he was prepared for another round of humiliation, another chance to put a black defendant in their place. This time, the defendant was Amara Rivers, a woman with a reputation of her own. Amara Rivers was no stranger to adversity. Born in a small town, raised by a single mother who had fought every day to make ends meet, Amara had learned the harsh realities of life at an early age. But what set her apart was her resilience, an unyielding drive to rise above the challenges that life threw her way. She had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, becoming one of the top lawyers in the country by the age of 35. Her expertise lay in criminal defense and civil rights law, and she had earned a reputation for taking on the hardest, most impossible cases, always emerging victorious. Her clients trusted her implicitly, and her opponents feared her presence in the courtroom. On this day, however, Amara was not the lawyer. She was the defendant. Amara had been pulled over by two officers earlier in the week, falsely accused of parking on the wrong side of the road in a part of Eldridge where parking was legal. The officers had claimed that they had seen her vehicle parked illegally, despite the fact that Amara had carefully checked the street signs and even noted that she was well within the bounds of the law. When she had tried to explain herself, the officers had become belligerent, dismissing her claims and asserting that they had seen it with their own eyes. Amara had been issued a ticket, but she knew the real reason behind it. It was racial profiling, nothing more, nothing less. Despite the false accusation, Amara had remained calm. She had not fought with the officers, nor had she gotten angry. Instead, she had done what she always did: she had filed a complaint, gathered evidence, and prepared herself for the battle ahead. She knew what kind of man Judge Grayson was, and she knew how this court was likely to unfold. But she wasn't about to let a racist judge or two corrupt officers walk all over her. The courtroom grew silent as Judge Grayson called the session to order. He shuffled through his papers before turning his attention to Amara, his eyes narrowing with the familiar glint of disdain. "Miss Rivers," Grayson began, his voice dripping with condescension, "we meet again. I must say, I do hope you're not planning to waste my time with more of your nonsense today." Amara stood tall, her back straight and her shoulders squared. Her demeanor was calm, unflinching, like a lioness about to face a predator. She took a deep breath before responding. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I am here to contest the false charges brought against me by the two officers who have sworn to uphold the law but, in this case, have chosen to disregard it for reasons of their own." A small murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Grayson's eyes flicked to the officers in the gallery, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. He gestured for one of the officers to stand. "Officer Collins, would you kindly explain to the court exactly what transpired during this incident?" Grayson sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Officer Collins, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, stood up and cleared his throat. He wore a look of arrogance that matched Grayson's own. "Your Honor," Collins began, "I was on patrol with Officer Davis when we observed Miss Rivers' vehicle parked on the wrong side of the road, blocking traffic. We tried to issue a citation, but she became argumentative and combative." "Argumentative and combative?" Amara interrupted, her voice sharp. "I was neither argumentative nor combative. I simply explained that I had parked legally, and the officers refused to listen." The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Let's not interrupt the officers, Miss Rivers," he said, his tone dismissive. "Officer Collins, please continue." Collins nodded smugly. "As I was saying, when we tried to issue the citation, Miss Rivers became belligerent. She started making accusations about racial profiling, but we were just doing our job. Is that so?" Amara asked, her eyes narrowing. "Did you ever ask me for my side of the story, Officer Collins?" The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by her question. I didn't feel it was necessary. She was parked illegally, and that was that." Grayson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with obvious pleasure. "Well, it seems like the evidence is clear, Miss Rivers. What do you have to say in your defense?" Amara's gaze shifted briefly to the two officers before she stood up, her voice suddenly clear and commanding. "I have quite a bit to say, Your Honor. But first, let me introduce myself properly." She paused for dramatic effect, watching as the faces of the officers faltered, their arrogance slipping away. "I am Amara Rivers, and I am a senior partner at Rivers, Banks, and Associates, one of the top civil rights law firms in this state. I specialize in criminal law, and I have defended dozens of cases involving police misconduct. I have never once been combative when I was right. And I am not about to start now." Gasps filled the courtroom, and the judge's expression flickered briefly with surprise. He had not anticipated this. The officers' faces were suddenly pale, their arrogance replaced with unease. Miss Rivers, you failed to inform the officers of your professional background," Grayson remarked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What, pray tell, does that have to do with anything?" "I failed to inform them because I didn't want them to treat me differently," she responded coolly. "But I see that now, had I shown them my credentials, I might have been treated with a little more respect. Perhaps you, Your Honor, would have treated me with more respect had you known who I was before today." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time in years, Grayson looked uncertain, his fingers tapping nervously on his desk. Over the next hour, Amara systematically dismantled the officer's testimony. She produced photographs of the parking signs showing that parking was legal on the street, along with witness statements from nearby businesses that had seen the incident unfold. She cross-examined the officers with surgical precision, pointing out discrepancies in their statements and their outright lies. As the evidence mounted, Judge Grayson's demeanor began to change. His face flushed with frustration, his usual smugness replaced by irritation. He tried several times to interrupt, but Amara's quiet confidence drowned him out. It was clear now that she was in control of the room. Finally, after the officers had been thoroughly exposed as liars, Amara turned her attention to Grayson. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority, "you have allowed a culture of bias and injustice to flourish in this courtroom for far too long. It is time for it to stop. I demand that these charges be dismissed, and that the officers involved be held accountable for their actions." For the first time in his career, Grayson was speechless. He sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. The court was dead silent, and for a long moment, the only sound was the soft tick of the clock on the wall. Grayson cleared his throat and finally spoke. "This court finds that the charges against Miss Rivers have no merit. The officers involved are hereby reprimanded, and the case is dismissed." As Amara walked out of the courtroom, she knew she had won not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been subjected to Grayson's cruelty. She had exposed the flaws in the system, and for the first time in years, the courtroom felt like it might just be a place of true justice. As Amara stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of victory settled over her like a cloak. The once oppressive air of the courthouse had shifted, and for the first time, justice had spoken louder than the prejudices that had tried to silence it. The officers were exposed, the judge had been forced to reckon with his own biases, and the town of Eldridge had witnessed what true courage and integrity looked like. But while this battle had been won, the war against injustice was far from over. The fight for fairness, for equality, and for a legal system that serves all people, not just the privileged, was one that needed to continue. Amara's victory was a spark, a reminder that those who dare to stand up, even in the face of the most intimidating systems, can ignite change. If you believe in the power of truth, if you're committed to challenging systems of bias and oppression, then don't stay silent. Stand up, speak out, and be a part of the movement toward justice. Share Amara's story with others. Leave a comment below about what you think should be done to reform our justice system, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories of courage, truth, and the fight for what's right. Together, we can make a difference. And together, we can make sure that stories like Amara's are no longer the exception, but the rule.